On a June night in 1970, a pitcher threw a no-hitter. That part is documented. What he claims was happening inside his head while he did it, that is the part that has divided the eyewitnesses who were there, the reporters who covered him, and baseball historians for decades. His name was Dock Ellis. And this is where the story gets genuinely strange. Because years later, that same pitcher would swear he could barely see the man standing in the batter's box. He would say the baseball changed size in his hand, swelling and shrinking, that the catcher's signals seemed to glow. That, at one point, he became convinced the umpire calling balls and strikes was President Richard Nixon. Dock Ellis pitched in the major leagues for 12 seasons. He won a World Series, started an All-Star game, and walked away with a reputation as one of the loudest, most fearless, most divisive men ever to put on a uniform. The press of his era pinned a single word on him: militant, and he wore it like armor. He called himself the Muhammad Ali of baseball, and he meant it. But peel back the noise, and you find a far more complicated man than the cartoon. A man whose wildest story might not even be the most important thing he ever did. So we are counting down the moments that built the legend, the controversies that nearly buried it, and a twist almost no one sees coming. It begins with a kid from Los Angeles who came within one bad decision of never making it at all. Number 12, the kid who almost blew it. Long before the headlines, there was a teenager in Los Angeles who loved the game far more than the game loved him back. Dock Philip Ellis grew up in a working-class household, the son of a man everyone knew as Big Dock. He had real talent and a temper to match it. At his mostly white high school in Gardena, he once refused to play after a teammate hit him with a racial slur, an early sign of a man who would never simply swallow an insult to keep the peace. What kept him on track was a former Negro Leagues pitcher named Chet Brewer, who steered him toward a future in professional ball. Then Pittsburgh came calling. Ellis had heard the Pirates were handing out signing bonuses as high as $60,000, and he wanted his cut of it. Then it nearly all came apart. He was arrested for taking a car that was not his. He got off with probation, but the team got cold feet, and that $60,000 dream collapsed into a signing bonus of roughly $2,500. There was something heavier hanging over him too. At 17, he was told he carried the sickle cell trait, a distinction from the disease itself, the one that still carried weight. He lost his father, Big Dock, at 18. The odds were stacked against him before he ever threw a professional pitch. And the climb through the minor leagues was slow. 4 hard years of small towns and long bus rides. Somewhere in there, the pills crept in. The first quiet handshake with a habit that would shadow him for 2 decades. When he finally reached Pittsburgh in the summer of 1968, he announced himself the only way he knew how, picking up a win in his very first appearance against the Los Angeles Dodgers, the team he had grown up watching. If most young men would have folded under all of it, Ellis did the opposite. He turned every chip on his shoulder into fuel. Number 11, the man who scared baseball with curlers. By the early 1970s, Ellis had figured out something most ballplayers never did. Attention was a kind of power, and he had a gift for commanding it. In 1973, he found a way to do it without throwing a single pitch. A newspaper photograph captured him warming up with his hair wrapped in curlers, tucked under an oversized cap. It went off like a bomb. To Ellis, it was nothing, just grooming, something plenty of black men did at home, brought into the open. To baseball's old guard, it was an act of rebellion against everything the sport stood for. He was told to knock it off, and he pointed the finger straight at the commissioner's office. There are many black men who wear curlers to help their hair. he said. Baseball is getting behind the times again. But the curlers were just a costume. His real weapon was what came out of his mouth. In an era when black players were expected to keep their heads down and be grateful for the chance, Ellis said exactly what he thought about the racism stitched into the sport. And he said it on the record over and over. Reporters slapped him with the same label they hung on Curt Flood and Dick Allen. Troublemaker, militant. He took the word and made it his own. He also lent his voice to something far bigger than himself, joining the fight against sickle cell disease, a cause that was personal, since he carried the trait. He was loud on purpose. But the most historic thing he was ever part of happened almost in total silence. Number 10, the lineup that made history in silence. On the 1st of September 1971, something happened at a major league ballpark that had never happened before in the sport's history. Manager Danny Murtaugh handed in a starting lineup made up entirely of black and Latino players: Clemente, Stargell, Sanguillen, Oliver, and on the mound, Dock Ellis. Nobody called a press conference. The team didn't put out a statement. It simply happened quietly, in the middle of a pennant race. Ellis pitched poorly that night and left early. He probably wanted to forget the outing, but the 9 men who took that field made a kind of history no ERA could measure, and the one man Ellis admired most was watching. Number 9, the letter from Jackie Robinson. Right around the time Ellis was making the most noise of his career, an envelope arrived. Inside was a handwritten letter from Jackie Robinson, the man who had broken baseball's color line and knew better than anyone what it cost to speak up. Robinson did not tell him to calm down. He told him to keep going. I read your comments in our paper the last few days, Robinson wrote, and wanted you to know how much I appreciate your courage and honesty. In my opinion, progress for today's players will only come from this kind of dedication. Then he pushed him further. Try to get more players to understand your views, and you will find great support. You have made a real contribution. Ellis would call that letter one of his most prized possessions for the rest of his life. The brass showman everyone loved to argue about had a hero, and his hero had just told him he was on the right path. The timing could not have been better because out on the field, Dock Ellis was about to have the season of his life. Number 8, the year he owned the game. 1971 belonged to Dock Ellis. He came out of the gate scorching and would not cool off. Sitting at 14 wins against just 3 losses by mid-season. By midsummer, he had earned something that was hard to argue with: the starting assignment for the National League in the All-Star game. But Ellis, being Ellis, he turned it into theater first. He told reporters there was no chance the league would ever let 2 black pitchers start against one another, himself and the American League's young phenom, Vida Blue. So of course they did. Whether it was clever reverse psychology or just Ellis talking his way into the moment, it remains the only time 2 black starters have ever faced off to open an all-star game. The night itself did not go his way. Reggie Jackson stepped in and crushed a pitch so violently that it slammed into a light tower on the stadium roof, a blast that some swore would have sailed 500 or even 600 feet if the building had not gotten in the way. Ellis took the loss in the exhibition, but the season ended the only way that counted. Ellis took the ball in Game 1 of the World Series against the Baltimore Orioles, and when the dust settled in October, the Pirates were champions of the world, and he had a ring and a 19-win season on his record. He had climbed to the very top of the mountain, which, for a man wired like Ellis, was exactly the moment things started to get dangerous. Number 7, the day he declared war on Cincinnati. The first day of May, 1974. Dock Ellis had decided his team had a problem, and the problem was fear. He believed the Pirates were intimidated by the Big Red Machine, the most feared lineup in the sport. So he came up with a fix that made sense to no one but him. He would hit every Red who stepped to the plate. First up, Pete Rose, drilled. Second, Joe Morgan, drilled. Third, Dan Dressen, drilled. Bases loaded, nobody out, and not one batter had taken a real swing. Up came Tony Perez, who read the situation, danced out of the way of the pitches, and drew a walk that forced in a run. Then Ellis turned to Johnny Bench and fired 2 pitches straight toward his head. That was the end of it. Murtaugh walked out and pulled him before he could do any more damage. No pitcher had hit 3 men in a row to start a game in roughly 80 years. Ellis never hid what he had been trying to do. "I tried to deck him twice," he later said of Bench. "I threw at his jaw and he moved. I threw at the back of his head and he moved." It was reckless, bizarre, and pure Ellis, a man who believed intimidation was a strategy. But it was far from the only time his fury put him at war with the world around him. Number 6. Always at war with someone. 2 years before that, Ellis had run into trouble of an entirely different sort, and that time he was the one on the receiving end. At Cincinnati's Riverfront Stadium in 1972, a security guard demanded that he show identification. Ellis, a well-known major leaguer in his own ballpark city, could not produce it on the spot, and the encounter spun out fast. He was pepper sprayed and detained. The charges were later dropped and the team issued an apology, but the image of a World Series champion being treated like a trespasser in his own stadium stuck with him for years. Ellis never forgot a slight and never backed down from authority. When he later landed with the New York Yankees, he feuded openly with owner George Steinbrenner over money, telling anyone who would listen that the boss should stay upstairs and count it. Around that same stretch, he put a fastball squarely into Reggie Jackson's face and sent him to the hospital for x-rays. And yet, even amid all that friction, he could still pitch. That first year in New York, he won 17 games and took Comeback Player of the Year, proof the talent never left him, no matter how much chaos surrounded it. Then the wheels turned again. In Oakland, he reportedly set a stack of pitching charts on fire in the clubhouse. The sprinklers came on, the whole room got soaked. Within weeks, he was gone. If you are keeping score, that is 1 World Series ring, 1 All-Star start, 1 Mace incident, 1 beaning of Reggie Jackson, 1 attempted decking of Johnny Bench, and 1 indoor rainstorm, all before his 33rd birthday. Wherever Ellis went, friction followed close behind. But all of it, the feuds, the beanballs, the burning paper, the fury, was being fed by something happening quietly, out of sight. Something insiders from that era have since confirmed in interviews. Known widely, discussed almost never. Number 5, the open secret nobody would say out loud. Every highlight you have watched so far, the All-Star start, the World Series ring, the beanballs, the curlers, the burning pitching charts, Ellis later said all of it happened through a chemical fog. Not occasionally. Every single start. In his own words, given plainly in interviews, he never once took the mound in the major leagues completely sober. And here's the part that makes that claim land differently than you might expect. He was far from alone. His crutch was amphetamines, the little pills that moved through big league clubhouses as casually as sunflower seeds. He would swallow a fistful before taking the mound, determined, as he put it, to out-medicate whoever he was facing that day. The pills were, by the accounts of players and journalists from that era, an open secret across the game, a performance booster that the men in charge preferred to pretend did not exist. Layered on top of that was the drinking, year after year, quietly hollowing him out. Understanding that world matters because it is the backdrop for the single most famous thing Dock Ellis ever claimed to do, and the single most disputed. To get to the legend, you have to travel back to that misty night in San Diego, and you have to begin with what we know for certain actually happened. Number 4, the night it actually happened. The 12th of June, 1970, San Diego Stadium. Dock Ellis took the mound against the Padres in the first game of a doubleheader, and over the next 9 innings, he pulled off something only a small club of pitchers ever manage. He threw a no-hitter. Not one Padre put a clean hit in play all night. This part is not up for debate. It is right there in the box score. The final was 2-0. Both runs delivered by Willie Stargell, who launched a pair of home runs. It was anything but tidy. Ellis walked 8 batters and plunked another, loading the bases more than once and tight rope walking the edge of disaster, inning after inning. The crowd at San Diego Stadium that night had no idea what they were watching. Just a wild walking pitcher somehow escaping every jam he created. His teammates rescued him with their gloves. Matty Alou ran down balls in the gaps, and Bill Mazeroski speared a line drive that looked headed for the outfield grass. When the final hitter took a called third strike, it was official. The 4th no-hitter in the history of the franchise, a true career-defining feat. And for the next 14 years, that was the entire story. Then Dock Ellis started talking, and the whole thing changed forever. Number 3, what he claimed was really going on. In 1984, a sports writer named Bob Smezik published an account that transformed an ordinary no-hitter into an immortal legend. According to Ellis, he had not simply been pitching that night in San Diego. He had been deep under the influence of LSD. The way he told it, he was a Los Angeles native who had used an off day to go home, lost track of which day it even was, and dosed himself, only for a friend to glance at the newspaper and inform him he was scheduled to start that very night. He scrambled onto a flight, made it to the park with barely any time to spare, and walked to the mound in a state he could hardly put into words. "I can only remember bits and pieces of the game," he said. "I was psyched. I had a feeling of euphoria." In the years that followed, the details only grew stranger and more vivid in the retelling. The ball seemed to swell and shrink in his hand. Sometimes, he said, he could not see the catcher at all, and his catcher supposedly wore reflective tape on his fingers just so Ellis could read the signs. He became convinced the home plate umpire was Richard Nixon. At one point, he claimed he was sure he was pitching to the musician Jimi Hendrix, who stood in the batter's box swinging a guitar instead of a bat. There is a strange wrinkle in how the tale first surfaced. The author of an early book about Ellis admitted he first printed a softer cover story that Ellis had pitched after a long night of drinking because Ellis feared the truth would cost him with his team. Only later was it swapped for the version the world knows now. It was an unforgettable story. There was only one problem. Plenty of people who were actually there do not believe a word of it. Number 2, but was it even true? The harder you look at Dock Ellis's most famous story, the shakier the ground gets. Start with the man who covered the team that night. The beat writer Bill Christine was inside that ballpark, spoke with Ellis afterward, and has always insisted there was nothing unusual about him at all. "We took pride in our reporting," he said, "and we had no indication that Doc was acting any different that day than any other day." Other writers pointed out a simple truth. Ellis loved to spin a tall tale, floating outrageous claims just to see who would swallow them. Even his own teammate Steve Blass laughed the story off, joking that he did not believe a syllable of it, but might go buy some LSD anyway, just to hedge his bet. Then there are the cracks in the story itself. Ellis remembered hitting a couple of batters that night. The record shows he hit exactly one. In some versions of the story, Ellis named Timothy Leary as his source. Reporters who looked into it noted that Leary was imprisoned in California at the time, though Ellis's accounts of the night varied enough across the years that pinning down any single detail is its own exercise in uncertainty. Not everyone was a doubter. His close friend Scipio Spinks swore Ellis was telling the truth, pointing to how well he knew Ellis's habits. Smizek, the reporter who first broke the story, never wavered from it. One writer who sat with Ellis near the end of his life landed in the middle, suggesting that whatever Ellis took earlier, by game time he was running on the same fuel as half the league. So which is it? Decades later, no one can prove it in either direction. And maybe that is the wrong question to be asking in the first place. Because the most remarkable thing about Dock Ellis is not the night he could barely remember. It is everything he did with all the years that came after it. Number one, the twist nobody saw coming. For most of his career, Dock Ellis was a man at war with himself. The pills, the drinking, they were always there, humming underneath all the noise and the headlines. By the time he walked away from the game around 1980, the habit had very nearly swallowed him whole. And then the loudest man in baseball did the quietest, hardest thing of his entire life. He got clean, not for a season, not for a headline or a comeback story, for good. With a push from former big leaguer Don Newcomb, Ellis checked himself into a treatment center in the Arizona desert and turned the page completely. He traded the ballpark for prisons, rehab centers, and juvenile halls, working as a drug counselor to the kind of people the rest of the world had already written off. He sat across from addicts and inmates and told them the truth about where their road was heading, because he had walked every mile of it himself. A man named John Shandy, who Ellis counseled during a stretch behind bars, told ESPN that without Doc, he would likely be dead or serving a life sentence, that the man changed his entire world. Ellis stayed clean for 28 years, nearly twice as long as his entire playing career. In the end, the disease he had fought so hard to escape caught up with him in a different form. His liver began to fail. He had no health insurance, and old friends from the game quietly stepped in to help cover his bills. On the 19th of December 2008, his body finally gave out, and he passed away at 63. Years before, Jackie Robinson had written to tell him he was on the right path. Ellis spent the last 3 decades of his life proving Robinson wasn't wrong, just early. The world remembered him for one surreal night on a pitcher's mound. But the people whose lives he helped rebuild remembered something else entirely. That is the paradox of Dock Ellis. He is immortalized for 9 innings he claimed he could barely see, a story we may never be able to verify. When what many who knew him came to call the most important work of his life happened far from any stadium. With no cameras rolling and no crowd roaring his name, a man made famous by a game he could not remember spent 3 decades making certain that other people could hold on to theirs. And here is the curious twist of timing. His legend only truly exploded after he was gone. Decades later, a recording of Ellis telling the story in his own gravelly voice was set to animation and raced around the internet to millions who had never seen him pitch. A full-length documentary followed, one that finally tried to capture the whole man, not just the punchline, the activist, the counselor, the human being underneath the myth. So here is the real thing to sit with. The scoreboard says he did it. The box score says he walked 8 men and survived on luck and his teammates' gloves. And Dock Ellis says he was somewhere else entirely that night. Here's the thing, all three can be true at once. And that might be the most baseball sentence ever written. So tell me below, do you believe him? Because more than 50 years later, nobody who was actually there has been able to prove he's lying. And nobody has been able to prove he's telling the truth. If this story pulled you in, hit that like button and subscribe, because the next forgotten figure we dig into just might be the most unbelievable one yet. Until then, keep questioning the legends.